Thanks, Kaz, and thanks, Nick. And so I'm delighted to be speaking, and also delighted to be taking on the role of the chair of the Scientific Advisory Board, and say very big shoes to follow with Nick. So there are some conflicts of interest. So I thought I'd just sort of very quickly just say, obviously, so where were we with clinical trials in sort of the last last year or so? Well, obviously, the reality was obviously coronavirus basically has put a big dent into a lot of both new research and also ongoing trials. I mean, we've heard a lot from Catherine and other people talking about obviously the impact on the patient community, but obviously again for the for us as researchers, trying to keep trials ongoing was very challenging. Recruitment for a lot of trials did sort of drop, and obviously also any new trials, ethics committees were actually we're basically coping with obviously the new ways of working, but also we're actually trials that were looking at COVID and vaccines, etc., were obviously far more important than sort of trials in other sort of diseases. So really, there has been a bit of a hiatus really in the last year or so with regards to what's going on. But what I'm going to do is just take you through some of the advances that there have been. The good thing is when you look at on clinicaltrials.gov and look at trials that are actively recruiting, and this is obviously dependent on researchers putting their trials onto this platform, but we can see that at the moment across, not just in the UK but in worldwide, there are at least sort of 16 trials on studies looking at OI, and I've sort of highlighted the research areas. There's obviously interest in genetics, bone targeted therapies, which we'll talk a little bit more about. We've heard again from Kaz and people about obviously the wider aspect of the disease affecting other body parts. And again, it's good to see that research is focusing on that. Non-drug treatment, so physiotherapy, or sort of orthotics, things like that, and also looking at the natural history of the disease, because again, I think as Kaz highlighted in his talk, understanding the aging process of what happens with individuals with OI over time is really important, so you can check whether your interventions are actually making a difference to the natural course of the disease. So doing these sorts of projects is really, really important. One thing, again, I think that's really important is again, getting the patient voice into what are our research priorities and clinical trials. And again, there was this work was done through the James Lind Alliance, and again, BBS were one of the sort of stakeholders involved. And this project was again identifying research themes that patients thought were important. So I think it's really useful that we do that. And again, although this was perhaps across the spectrum of the diseases, fibrous dysplasia, X-linked hypophosphatemic rickets, and OI, you can probably again pick out from this sort of the questions and answers that you would like sort of answering. I think it's just really important that the research that we do, the clinical trials that we put in place, are actually delivering what patients want. And again, I think that's something I'm quite keen to be trying to move with the BBS and the Scientific Advisory Board, that perhaps we will be focusing on themed calls for research proposals, so that we try and answer some of these questions that the patient group feel are important. So again, I've just put this slide up, and I think Jude Babia showed this a couple of years ago. And I think when we think of clinical trials, obviously there's a process that that any drug or intervention goes through with regards to testing its safety, initially in very small numbers of healthy volunteers. Then you move to sort of dosing it in smaller numbers of patients with the disease, working out what sort of drug you'll need, and then basically you move down this pathway. And I think what's quite interesting is that some of the drugs, like the bisphosphonates, we're sort of coming in. A lot of the groundwork's already been done, whereas obviously with some of the newer drugs, and like the Mereo drug that Nick alluded to at the end of his talk, some of those drugs have actually started further up the pathway, testing in sort of healthy volunteers and moving through. So I'm just going to focus on, again, the bone-targeted drugs, because that's where a lot of the research that currently is happening here in the UK is looking at. So again, in bone, if you're looking at trying to improve outcomes for patients, you're looking at the sort of bone cells that you can target, osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and osteocytes. And again, I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but essentially the bisphosphonates and sort of drugs like denosumab are shown on the left, and these drugs will actually inhibit the breakdown of bone. And then on the right, you've got sort of drugs that will actually stimulate and make bone being formed. And obviously, that sort of drugs as teriparatide, and we'll talk about the sclerostin antibody that Mario have been looking at as well. So essentially the drugs work in different ways, but the hope is by obviously modulating the bone structure, you're going to then improve fractures as an outcome. And obviously that's what, at least from the bone phenotype, is what's important. Obviously, as we discussed, there are sort of other aspects of the disease and the condition that are actually really, really important. So the ongoing study Topaz, which is obviously being coordinated by Stuart Ralston's team in Edinburgh, is ongoing. And again, this study has been sort of quite severely affected by COVID, because recruitment stopped. It was actually more difficult to get patients up to site. But again, at least in our site, we've got cohorts of patients that are now getting into the end of the 2-year course of teriparatide and are switching over to having their zoledronic acid. And there, again, recruitment is still active. So again, I would encourage anyone who perhaps hasn't been part of this study already to sort of identify where their local sites are, and to then sort of still get involved, because this study is going to run even after the 2 years of treatment. Patients will then be followed up for several years after, and the idea is to see if there is an impact on fractures. So again, there's still plenty of time for people to sign up and get into the study, because it's going to be running for several more years as the follow-up continues. But this study will really hopefully address whether teriparatide followed by bisphosphonate is better than sort of the standard care that a lot of us may be providing for adults with OI, at least with regards to fractures as the endpoint. And then the other way that you can stimulate bone formation is through using these sclerostin antibodies. And the difference here is that not only are you stimulating bone formation, sort of shown in the solid bar, but you're actually inhibiting bone resorption, shown in the sort of the hatched bar. So the idea there is you've got this bigger sort of almost therapeutic window, which potentially will represent new bone being formed. And obviously this was the basis of the drug that was being studied in the asteroid study. I just wanted to sort of finish by sharing some of the results from this study. And again, Kaz was the sort of the lead PI on this. But essentially, the study was in adult patients with OI. There was an initial treatment period, which was for 12 months. And there was initially at the beginning a sort of a placebo arm as well. But what happened then was obviously once they realized the drug was obviously doing well, the patients in the placebo switched to the high dose, and there were basically three sort of doses of treatment. And the idea was that people would be treated for 12 months. At the end of that time, then they would receive treatment at the discretion of the clinician, whether it had gone to bisphosphonate. And then obviously there were intermediary measures looking at bone density assessments. As Nick said, obviously this study now is being looked at again, so that these patients will potentially get further treatment with the drug going forward. Essentially, the study in total recruited just over 100 patients, and obviously the people that were in the sort of the 3 blinded arms was about 80. There were a small number of people that discontinued, but safety of the drug was pretty good. These were the demographics of the group, and as you can see, sort of mean age was about 40. There was obviously pretty much a reasonable split of male female, and again you can see that the study recruited those with type 1 and those with type 3 and type 4 OI. Essentially, when we looked at the data, and again, so they looked at 2 different ways of assessing bone density. One was with sort of looking at bone density measurements of the arm using sort of QCT measurements. And if you concentrate on the right column there, you can see that in the both in the high and the medium group, the improvements that were seen was significant in that the p-value was below 0.05. So basically there were improvements using this measure, but this is something we don't normally do in routine practice. And when we looked at standard bone density using Dexa, again, you can see the improvements very much. There was a sort of relationship between the higher, medium and lower dose that were significantly different. And again, this response was seen in both those with type 1 and type 3 and type 4. Again, just from the manufacturers, again, they compare these improvements in bone density that you see at the spine and the hip, and compared it to a smaller study that had been done in using teriparatide. And you can see that the improvements with the anti-sclerostin antibody were greater than you'd see with teriparatide. So that's of interest. The studies weren't designed to actually look at fractures, obviously within that patient group, but you can see there's a trend perhaps that in the high dose group, there were less fractures that were occurring than compared to those in the medium and low group. And as Nick pointed out, not only is there now going to be perhaps a study in adults, but again, this has formed the basis for a sort of a further study in children, where obviously the fracture rates are probably going to be higher, and so therefore this could then potentially be a new therapy that could be available to children with OI. And so that is a very whistle-stop tour of where we are with OI research at the moment, and hopefully that as things settle down with COVID, things will improve. I think there's some exciting times ahead. So thank you very much.